It's pretty simple. Trade should work for America, not the other way around. But for way too long, we've let bad deals and global elites call the shots. BlazeTV host Auron MacIntyre wrote about how President Trump's approach to trade isn't just about dollars and cents. It's about putting American workers first and making sure that our economy serves us, not the global order. So he joins us right now. So Auron, thanks for coming on the show tonight. So how does Trump's trade agenda benefit the American citizens, right? Everybody out there is wondering, they see the headlines all the time. So what is it actually doing for the American people right now?
Well, obviously, for a lot of people, we see the offshoring of industries as something that is very dangerous. It takes away jobs that many people in the lower middle class were relying on to be able to climb the socioeconomic ladder. But more importantly, it also puts us in a position where we are mortgaging our national security for cheaper products. We discovered during COVID that places like China make a large percentage of our ventilators and our antibiotics, which matters quite a bit when you also find out that ultimately they're a place where a deadly disease came from that is destroying you during the pandemic. We also know that different processors that we need, semiconductors that we need to launch missiles in our military, are primarily made in China. That's a wild move if ultimately you believe they are your most serious geopolitical threat. But we are not taking the security of our supply lines or the security of our economy seriously. Instead, we're maximizing profit and theoretical efficiency while ultimately leaving American workers and American security behind.
And the interesting thing about this is that I feel as if prudence or the wisdom, political wisdom, which traditionally means the right thing at the right time in the right place, and stuff changes. The environment changes, the circumstances change. And so you have to change your policy or your approach. But in this case, the right really seems to be hindered by, let's call them, maybe those your words, free trade absolutists, or the sort of libertarian vibes that have been around the right for a long time, where the mentality seems to be free trade all the time, regardless of what that means, right? And that seems to be the problem on the right? Why there's so much friction. Do you agree? And if so, talk to us more about why that's the case.
So many people will talk about things like peace through strength, and that's understandable. You need to know that there are consequences for bad actions. You can't unilaterally disarm yourself and just expect everyone else to follow suit. And yet economically, that's exactly what the United States has done. We've declared ourselves free trade ideologues, adherents to this semi-religion that defines conservatism, and lower tariffs and trade barriers the only thing that matters. But of course, that's not the case. The reason we should want free trade is if it benefits the American people. This isn't our religion. This isn't our ideology. These aren't our principles. It's just an economic system. Now, if it's the best economic system and it benefits the United States and the people who live here, then we should embrace it. But if it isn't, or if there are some problems, or if we have to be willing to push back when other people abuse the system in order to make sure that it is working for the American people, then we should do that. Like you said, it's not about adhering to this as if it's a faith. This is ultimately a system that is made to serve us. And if it is the system that serves us best, then we should use it. But in the cases in which it's being exploited, which it very clearly is when it comes to relations with countries like China, we have to have a consequence. If we don't, then we're going to lose. That's exactly what we would expect in a military defense scenario. But for some reason, we act as if economics is somehow detached from this law of reality.
Well, it's funny when I just think about this, and it's like when you try and go through socialism and they say, oh, utopia, it's out there. You just haven't had the right socialism yet. Is there a place that you can get to where it is like the absolute free trade? It's actually going to work. It's going to be out there, and it is an attainable thing? Or is this more of the utopia that the leftists always try and just make a perfect scenario for?
A lot of people who talk about free trade don't think about the context in which it was even explored. Ricardo, who is one of the key economists that many people cite when it comes to free trade, pointed out that there is this comparative advantage that ultimately comes from trade when people specialize. But even in his own understanding of the theory, he assumed that people would prefer their own nation to other nations and that they would make decisions based on that fact. He didn't understand the idea that capital or labor would be constantly moving, that companies would decide to just go ahead and pick up and abandon the workers and the people that they had been founded in to move to another country where things would be cheaper, or that mass immigration would bring down wages in an insane way. These were just simply not things that were considered when the idea of free trade was ultimately born. And so when we're looking at this, it's not that the underlying economics don't necessarily work, but they were set in a time and in history where other assumptions about the way that people prioritize national identity and national security were, you could just kind of take them for granted. Today, we have gotten rid of those ideas. The ideas that we should prefer our nation, prefer its security, prefer the well-being of its people have been abandoned in the idea that we should chase this free-flowing economic ideology. This is something that would have looked very foreign to Ricardo and many others who were understanding economics at the time. And so we need to remember that we're not attacking the underlying economic truths here. We're simply putting them in the context in which they made any sense in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, never mind the fact, of course, that America had tariffs for a long time. The founders certainly had no problem with them, and neither did post-Civil War. The American system, which was coming back now, people are talking about the sort of financial regime we had then when there was no income tax, something that interests all of us very much here at the show. And you can see Trump has even talked about that. But there's at least two arguments for tariffs, and we brought this up in a conversation. Chris Bedford was talking about it with us last week, and they can potentially they're conflicting. And I'm curious what your take is, because one idea would be, look, we need to negotiate with these countries, right? So we level the playing field and we have something like free trade. The hilarious thing about the free trade absolutists is that we don't have free trade with these countries. So you put the tariff up there and they go, oh my gosh, we're going to get rid of our tariffs. Let's all just be equal, right? And then you actually have something akin to free trade. But of course, then there's also the problem of China and supporting China and countries like it, where you say, well, wait a minute, do we want China to come to the negotiating table and, to get down? Isn't that the exact opposite of what we want? In other words, do we want a long-lasting move into a tariff regime and to use these more frequently with countries, especially that aren't friendly, or are we trying to negotiate with them all for the sake of a freer trade?
Yeah, and the difficulty here is this is a complex web of interactions, right? We had a highly specialized global economy in situations where production was spread all across the globe in different areas. There was never going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. Obviously, there are certain sectors we have to reindustrialize in. We have to make sure our supply lines are very secure when it comes to things like weapons manufacturing, when it comes to our own energy independence, our ability to feed ourselves. These are different aspects of our society that we absolutely have to have control of. We need to know that when we need antibiotics, we can get them on a regular basis, and we don't have to rely on our greatest geopolitical opponent ultimately to do that. However, we were probably never going to move every single bit of manufacturing back into the United States. That just was probably a never realizable goal. And so the mix here is to try to encourage and incentivize the reshoring of industries that are critical to our national security while providing the jobs and economic security that they would bring. But ultimately, we also need to bring a fairer deal when it comes to the countries that we absolutely have to trade with. And we want to make sure that we are trading with countries we can trust. Okay, maybe we can put a certain level of reliance on countries that are closer to us, but maybe we shouldn't allow a high level reliance on someone like China who's openly hostile. That seems like a pretty reasonable stance to take. We work with the trading partners we need to secure our supply lines on a regular basis, but we pull ourselves away from hostile powers that ultimately we cannot continue to be reliant on in the long term. I think that's a good mix, a good effort that we should make across the board.
So let's take this now back to Washington, D.C., because there's a lot of lawmakers out there on Capitol Hill that are saying, oh, Donald Trump shouldn't have the only say in this. We need to have our 2 cents in here as well. So what would you want to see at least the Republicans on Capitol Hill do with this?
I mean, it's really funny. A lot of people have spoken about the dangers of having Donald Trump be the only man who can ultimately make decisions when it comes to tariffs, or not ultimately, but have a high degree of unassisted input when it comes to that. Very strangely, these people aren't talking about the War Powers Act, right? Like, Congress has ceded a large amount of power to the administrative state and even to the executive branch. And one of the most dangerous powers that they've handed over is the ability to unilaterally basically make war without the consultation of Congress. If you're really interested in wrestling back some control from the executive branch and restoring constitutional governance, maybe we should stop with one of the most fundamental checks and balances that has ever existed in the United States Constitution and return the ability to declare war back to Congress where it belongs. That said, I'm okay with Congress taking a more leading role in this, but I really wish they prioritize the areas in which they would like to claw back the constitutional protections that we actually value.
Yeah, very interesting move by Congress. I mean, I kind of like seeing a little bit of energy from Congress, just some sign of life. You want power and to wield it? Interesting. Creatures of the administrative state as they are. But let's talk about the right, though, a little bit more, because it's been interesting to watch. Kevin Roberts was on the show, president of Heritage Foundation, and he came out in support of what the president was doing. Took a lot of flack for that. And all these old clowns like Jonah Goldberg and that crew, the National Review crowd, they're still whining about this and very up in arms about it. And there's a lot of people in D.C., frankly, who are very uncomfortable with what's going on. They're afraid to say it. Because it's very different than anything that's happened, in a long time when it comes to these sorts of issues. And this is one that hits people on the right. So do you think there's a ability to change here? I mean, certainly the Trump agenda, and most people support Trump. I think the voters are with him on this for trying it out. But is there any room for change on the right? Because these people, they don't seem to be receptive. It seems like there's a bunch of them that just... this is their faith. This is their religion. Do you think there's any chance that they might be converted?
As Machiavelli pointed out, the most dangerous thing for any leader to do, and the most glorious thing that any leader can do, is to introduce new modes and orders. When you have a situation where you're introducing a new system, this is always the case. You're going to have the people who used to benefit from the old system, they're going to be against you. And even the people who theoretically would benefit from the new system, they're going to be lukewarm in their support because ultimately they don't know how it's going to turn out, where it's going to land. The thing that makes you a leader, the thing that makes you decisive, the thing that makes you worthy of being in a position of power is ultimately being able to navigate that and able to instantiate an order that you think is going to benefit the American people. So I do think it's possible that when you start to see victories come in, when you see stalwart leadership from President Trump, that ultimately people might be on his side. But as with any system, there's always the possibility of failure. And so there are always going to be people who are sitting on the fence, waiting till the last minute, or even defending the system as it was, simply because they don't know what the new system will look like. That's understandable, that's predictable, but ultimately, if Donald Trump wants to be a leader and he wants to make the type of changes that he was elected to make, he's going to have to be able to lead without necessarily listening to the peanut gallery when it comes to complaints about what might be happening here. Now, he should still be prudential. He should still apply good judgment. That doesn't mean that if something stops working or it doesn't look like it's going to actually follow through, that he should continue to do it just for the sake of trying to be right. But ultimately, it's going to have to be his leadership and his decisiveness that drives this through. I wouldn't be looking for congressional Republicans to simply come along and say, yeah, we're going to brisk it all on Donald Trump. They've basically pushed it back against Trump at every level until they absolutely had to accept him. And I really don't think there's going to be any difference when it comes to tariffs.